Hello class, I hope everybody's doing really well. I'd like to apologise in advance for my stuffy nose. Figures. Graphical representations used to clarify, interpret and analyse data. This involves plotting points and drawing line segments, surfaces and other geometric forms that let us intuitively gain some insight to the data we've collected. In short, we can say that tables are for readers who want to see the dirty details and figures for readers who want to see the pattern of the data. The concept of plotting a point in space dates back to the ancient Greeks. However, the 15th and 16th century was the period when mathematicians like René Descartes and his contemporaries really started taking hold of this idea. It would take another 200 years during the 17th and 18th century for the modern iteration of the graphs and tables that we know today to develop that we see in scientific papers. Statisticians like William Playfair literally invented these out of pure misery from being statisticians. If you're like me, you may remember pie charts from school, and I think that's where they really thrive because they're very interactive and they probably will find a new place in like digital media and stuff like that, infographics and those kinds of places. However, they're not very popular in academic journals. I think the main reasons why is they don't copy very well into monochrome. They're also difficult to label, but fundamentally they don't make it that much easier to spot trends when they're just statically on a page. So I won't be showing you any examples of those today. Next, we have bar charts, commonly used for comparing data of different groups or categories. These are extremely popular because they're easy to construct and usually very clear. Bar charts are so simple that you might be tempted to experiment with using three-dimensional figures. However, a sizable amount of research shows that they're just more confusing than two-dimensional ones, so best to keep it simple. The examples that I'll be presenting from my bed are taken from the World Inequality Report from 2022. For my example bar graph, I'm using the female labour income share in China from 1990 to 2020. I think this graph is a really good example because it can highlight a couple different things that a bar graph can be used for. So for example, this shows change over time from each decade, 1999, 2000, 2010, and 2022, but it can also show us where the gender parity is. So if we had perfect equality between the sexes in terms of income, of course that would be 50% male, 50% female. Just some fun facts about the graph. China is at 33%, which is significantly higher than the average in Asia, which is just 21%, and beats out Japan, that is 28%. However, if you look at the change over the decades, we can see that it's been dipping down by about 6% over the last 40 years, and this may be an area to research to see why that trend may be, but very interesting bar graph for you. Line graphs show trends over time. They're good for showing performance of two or more groups in different conditions. One thing to be aware of is that they can be distorted by expanding or contracting the spaces in between the measures. Another thing they got going for them is they're good for showing interactions that can be hard to describe using words. I found this to be a really interesting application of the line graph. It shows the inequality between the top 10% and the bottom 50% in terms of income shares in China. So we can distinctly see that China's got a very interesting historical trajectory. So prior to 1940s, you can see that inequality was just rampant and it was awful. And then over the periods of the Communist Revolution, we can see that it was dramatically reduced to a point where there was actually, a good 2 decades, 4 decades where it basically didn't change. Then with the economic reforms of the early 70s and the 80s, early 80s, we can see that inequality sort of came back again, but it hasn't reached pre-revolutionary levels. We believe the reason for that to be is just investment in health, education and infrastructure from the PRC. And I just thought this was an interesting graph to look at, and it shows trends over time and will be quite difficult to explain without being able to visualize in this way, I think. Classmates, teachers, thank you for your time watching this presentation. Here are my references in case you're curious. Here are some things for you to consider. Based on the two figures that we discussed, one about wealth inequality between the top 10% and poorest 50%, and between men and women in China, what misconceptions might these figures encourage people to glean?